Welcome everybody to this final workshop of the Go Open Data Workshop Day. And we're pleased to be a fairly large group here from two civic tech organizations. Three of us will introduce ourselves from Civic Tech St. John, and then two will introduce themselves from Civic Tech St. John, New Brunswick. And to start things off, I'll introduce myself, and then we'll go to John, and then Chatou. And then I'll turn it over to Michael in St. John, New Brunswick. So my name is Jonathan Brown. I'm a retired educator, volunteer. I wear two hats. I'm the GIS coordinator for Sustainable Cobourg, a nonprofit, very small one in Cobourg. And I'm also the director of education for Go Open Data. And I'm also the co-chair for the hackathon happening on this Saturday, May the 11th. And you're going to find out from this presentation about a hackathon that happened on April the 27th. And then we're going to have a discussion around how we might be able to do a similar hackathon up here, with the focus being on breaking barriers and building futures. John, who are you and what do you do?
I'm John. I am a programmer. I am a member of Civic Tech, a longtime member of Civic Tech Toronto, and I've been for some time a frontline worker with the St. Stephen's Outreach Program in Kensington Market of Toronto. And that's
And
my
you have to add the connection to Cobourg, John.
Oh yeah, my great grandfather was one of the first rectors, if not the first rector of St. Peter's Cobourg.
And St. Peter's Cobourg is where they have a warming house in the winter. And I forgot to add that I'm a long-standing member of Civic Tech Toronto as well. Chatou, welcome.
Hello, my name is Chatumini, or you can call me Chatu, and I'm a product designer with experience in the accessibility space. And I'm also from Civic Tech Toronto. I've been assisting with this project and a lot of the storytelling, the research, and kind of organizing all the problems and research we have so far. And I'm very excited to continue on and start solving for this problem.
And when we pull up the slides, you'll see an amazing illustration based on Chatou's talent. Okay, Michael.
Hi, I'm Michael Kerr. I'm a former educator and also did a lot of work in environmental geology. And I'm a member of Civic Tech St. John. And I retired a few years ago, my wife and I, well, semi-retired, I guess. And we both lived in Cobourg and taught in Cobourg in the area for about 30 years. So I'm out here in St. John now, and we just recently put together and hosted a hackathon called ID4All, and it was a very successful event.
Yeah, and I'm Suruchi from Civic Tech St. John, working actively as a volunteer. I was involved in making the hackathon in terms of organizing and getting it done. In my background, I am from India, came to Toronto in 2015 first, but decided that I want to come here for long. So came to St. John in 2022 as an UNB MBA student. And since then, I'm connected to Civic Tech. And I have a background of agile project management and digital transformation consultant. That's all from me.
So here's the purpose of the, well, actually the purpose is a challenge statement. It's the one that we're using for Civic Tech Toronto. And it's similar to the one that was used in St. John. And we're using the same title, ID for All. So here's our agenda. We've done the introductions, and we're going to first have Chatou help us understanding the problem using a journey mapping. And then we're going to turn to John, who's going to talk about community web of trust, and the 4 factors of identification. And then over to Civic Tech St. John, and they will talk about their experience. And then we will play the winning pitch, the Phoenix pitch. And then that will be the breaking barriers. And then we have a very short one from Coburg, and that I've just discovered this week. So I'll play that 30-second clip and talk about how that might build on what they did in St. John and what we're trying to do with Civic Tech Toronto. And then that'll wrap it up, and we'll leave lots of time for questions and answers. But feel free to add any comments into the chat or questions that you want to pose, and I'll do my best at moderating the chat site. So with that, over to you, Chateau.
Giving an overview of what I'll be doing. I'll be going over and understanding the problem, kind of breaking it down before we get into everything. And we'll be doing it by going through journey mapping and storytelling. In Civic Tech Toronto, we spent a couple of weeks working through a decision tree that really explains the current state and the current process of acquiring identification, but also leaving homelessness in Toronto. Giving an overview of the problem, identification is necessary for a multitude of services that we require in our day-to-day life. This can include hospital services, driving as well, even getting an education. They all require identification. Those facing chronic homelessness find it difficult to acquire and also hold permanent identification in Toronto. And generally everyone else too. But they face systemic barriers and obstacles in the current process of acquiring personal ID. Big question that we're answering here, I took this also from previously. How could local social service providers create greater awareness of and access to personal government identification to help individuals overcome, again, those systemic barriers to social resources and service delivery? As part of storytelling, I did create this little graphic that kind of illustrates the sense of losing not only your home, but also everything else that's lost with it, that becomes a barrier to getting an identification card. In the graphic, as you can see, what would you need to start over is kind of the big question that's being asked here. If you want to find a place to stay, if you want to acquire money from your bank account, if you even need to apply for a new job, you would all need forms of identification, thus keeping you in the cycle of chronic homelessness. Then if we move down to current state analysis, just scrolling, there we go, lovely. So now we're going over the preconditions and postconditions of homelessness, or chronic homelessness. So how do we even get in this position? And also, how do we leave it? So going into the preconditions of chronic homelessness, we've identified unemployment, drug addiction, or mental health, the lack of a permanent address, no place for storing personal belongings, that including of identification, and just generally being homeless. Chronic homelessness, which is different from that of homeless, is when you're without a home for more than 80 days. Correct me if I'm wrong. 80 days?
You're correct.
Lovely. So those are the kind of preconditions. Once an individual meets all or most of these conditions, especially the last one of without a home for more than 80 days, they're now in the cycle of chronic homelessness, and they now have trouble, or they've already lost their identification. Then going into the post conditions, which I also consider to be measures of success. How do you leave this cycle? How do you leave the system? So just scrolling down a little bit further. Also, if I'm going a little too fast, let me know. I understand this is a very small panel, but getting into the post conditions, I call it measures of success, which is basically how do you leave the system? So again, affordable housing is the first one, a permanent address, a secure place for those aforementioned personal belongings, including identification, a livable wage that keeps the affordable housing, and then also personal well-being. As mentioned before, mental health is a really big part of keeping, I suppose, that stability. So that's why we've included personal well-being. And all of these, spelling mistake. All of these measures of success require identification. And then going into this way, the current state analysis. This is the decision tree that we worked on with Rock and also Jonathan. And starting off at the beginning, big sentence, I need to acquire a government identification. First question you might be asking is, why do I need an ID? Maybe I need to use a service, or maybe I just honestly lost my wallet and I need an identification. If I need to use a service, what kinds of systems would require this? Two we identified here, all chronic care systems. Anytime you need to go to the hospital, you need to show your health card, your driver's license, some form of identification. And then additionally, other primary care offices. Let's say I need to go to the doctor's office, human services, social services. I also need a form of identification. Then let's say the other case is I've lost my ID. I need to go somewhere. How do I find out where to go? Where do I even look to finding an ID, to acquiring stability, to finding shelter? So here we have listed all these services and all these places where you might be looking for answers. This is for looking for information. Maybe I'm going to an ID bank. Maybe I'm going to a local city volunteer. We can scroll down a smidge more. Scroll down a bit more. There we go. Maybe I'm searching on Google. Maybe it's at the library. Maybe it's the word of mouth. All of these are forms of or places you'd find information to acquire an ID. Then going a little more this way. Let's say I did acquire this information. Oftentimes, this information would lead to a transition house, which is as I've defined here. It's a short-term. It's any kind of short-term accommodation. The formal transition house in Toronto, but basically a place where I'm able to either acquire shelter or it is shelter itself. Correct me if I'm wrong. Then even entering the transition house, this user or client, it's not simply just walking through the door. There's often several steps that in the current process that of Toronto and other places that we've identified a lot of pains and a lot of struggles in. So going through the intake process, let's say I walk into the door of this house, the first step of being greeted and even getting into this establishment, it's often waitlisted, there's often lines. A lot of people are often reluctant to take the first step. As John will go into more detail about anecdotes in this, but the social cues and the social kind of environment of entering these kind of places can vary. Then if we go into security check, so let's say someone who works here, they'll be checking the user for security, and this often feels invasive, sometimes even turned away, and there's pressure from both sides. It's a very intense environment. Then going into info intake, this is often the one that without an identification, you will struggle in the most. It's hard to establish trust from both sides, and the documentation process, it's not quickly in and out the door. It's often long-winded, taking several weeks. And then even if you're at the shelter and shelter compliance, maintaining that consistency, staying at the shelter takes effort from both sides, from both that of the workers and that of the users, of being able to maintain this long-term. So that's the overview of the transition house. If anyone has any intake or input, anything I glossed over. And then even if, let's say after receiving the information, I don't end up at the transition house. Instead, I find that this is a really big step for me to take. Maybe there's a lot of complex things that I need to address first. So again, in terms of family separation, homelessness, mental health, encampment as well. Maybe instead of turning to a shelter, there's again, we'll go into more anecdotes. There's cases of I'd rather stay at an encampment. I'd rather stay at a man-made society instead. But that's kind of the overview of the current decisions and the current tree of a lot of the processes, at least out of reference of Toronto. I'd like to hear inputs about others. And going into one last one, Jonathan, one other tidbit that would also be fun to help, fun to add, just go over this way, is that of photo ID within Ontario. So photo ID is one alternate kind of, I wouldn't say solution, I wouldn't say solution, but it is one thing to remark where if you do not have an identification, you're also able to get a request, like just a photo ID. This is not obviously a solution, but this is something to note that this is a possibility. Thank you. I hope this helps understand the problem. If there's anything you want me to go over again, let me know.
That was great. And just going back to the slides, because I did have a question. Yeah, storytelling. Now I know could you use that as a segue into John's talk?
Yes. So as I've already walked through this decision tree, and as I've talked through it already, and I'm putting you in this kind of in the sense of, or putting you in the space of someone who is facing chronic homelessness. I'm walking through the decision tree saying, as if you're someone who has lost their ID, where would you go for information? Where would you go in these processes? And kind of creating this more human experience. That's what storytelling is all about. To adhere and build on storytelling, John will be going through several anecdotes that would prove a lot of these processes that I've discussed previously. That helps.
Yeah, and I remember when I was working with an adult learning center in Toronto, at York region, and some of the newcomers there, they used what was called digital storytelling. So they would take a photo, one of their favorite photos that described or in a picture their lived experience, and then they did an audio graphic, a digital storytelling. That was a cool. Have you ever done those?
I've done storyboards with photos, yes. An audio one sounds very interesting to do. I think it could really help with this project.
Yeah. And then the idea is that from that storytelling, you get what's called a persona. Is that correct? I'm no expert on this.
Yes. Building
Okay.
towards a persona, yeah.
Okay. Yep, you should be able to hear me. Okay.
Yep.
I'm going to start with the concept of computer security experts who work in the basic 4 factors of identification are typically something you are, that would be a biometric identifier, such as fingerprints, facial recognition, more esoteric ones like retinal scans. Then something you have, such as an identification card, a driver's license, a passport, something that identifies you uniquely, that is a trusted document from a trusted issuer, something you know, obviously a password, a personal identification number, a passphrase, and then the concept of a trusted third party who will vouch for who you are. There are a couple of personal anecdotes I can share with you about these things, both concerning passports. Once a long time ago, I was shipwrecked and picked up in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, and came ashore in Pensacola. Very fortunately, I'd managed to salvage my passport and put it in my pocket. And so having a passport basically got me home. Without that, it would have been very difficult. So obviously something you have. And this comes back to the storytelling. I mean, this happened to me. Losing everything you have is a very uncommon situation for people who are comfortably middle class, but for people who have fallen into homelessness, it's pretty routine. If you get evicted from a shelter, if you get evicted for any reason, if you get evicted from a rooming house, your possessions end up on the street, and if those possessions, or if you can't sort through them quickly enough, you lose them, because there's a more or less conscious policy among a lot of civil servants to regard the possessions of homeless people as garbage. There's another story I will tell you about the web of trust is that once I went in to apply for a passport, and I needed one person's signature to vouch for that the person applying to renew my passport was in fact me. And fortunately, the clerk at the passport office was an old friend of mine, so I got their signature. So all of these things are important for identification. All of these things, it is important to have a discussion, which of course necessarily needs to include, as a matter of first principles, the people who are most in need of these services, the people who are experiencing homelessness and financial stress themselves, and about which of these factors of identification are most effective for them. Obviously, the problem with something you have is that it can be taken from you. The problem with something you know is that if it is obvious enough to remember, somebody else may duplicate it and duplicate it. And if it is unobvious enough, you're liable to forget it, as anyone who has ever forgotten a password can tell you, and I've forgotten several. Then there's the something you are is impossible to duplicate, but unfortunately, it's also impossible to escape from. And that creates another problem with trust of legal authorities and of the government, because once you are in the system as somebody who is biometrically identified, you're in there pretty much forever. And I'm going to go on a little bit more into the web of trust, because that is a useful concept. So maybe we can have the next slide. And okay, the concept of the web of trust started out in the open source community, and it is essentially the idea that somebody will vouch for you. Somebody you know personally will vouch that, yes, I know John Sprague. This is John Sprague. He is who he says he is. And then someone else or several someone else's will vouch for that person, that they are who they say they are, they can be generally trusted, and that they, well, basically that they are who they say they are, and they've proven trustworthy in the past. And then somebody will vouch for that person in turn. And the concept is that eventually the web of trust reaches certain very prominent anchor persons who everybody knows about. In the web of trust in the open source community, that means people like Richard Stallman and Tim Berners-Lee. It's also possible to have a neighborhood web of trust, using people who are well known in a particular neighborhood, in a particular area. And the advantage there is that the chain of trust, the number of people you would have to go through to reach somebody who is well known and well respected across the universe of people who needed to verify someone's identification, is a lot shorter than the computerized web of trust. So essentially, those are all factors in identification, and in my opinion, these are some of the starting points that we can begin with in working to design a program or a policy or simply a service that will verify the identification, the identities of people who are at risk in various stressful situations, and in this particular case, particularly homelessness, being unhoused, being street involved. Okay, and that is, I will gladly take questions later. There will be a question period, but that's pretty much what I've got to say for now.
Oh, could you add one anecdote? I thought it was a great one. The Kensington example of the statue.
The
one that was stolen and returned.
Right. Okay. Outside of St. Stephen's Anglican Church in Kensington, which St. Stephen's does a lot of work in feeding people who are unhoused and feeding people who are marginally housed and are deeply food insecure. Outside the church on the corner, near the corner of Bellevue Avenue and College Street, there's a statue which was done by Timothy Schmaltz, the well-known sculptor, of a panhandler who is sitting with an outstretched hand and a hoodie. And if you look closely, you will see that in his outstretched hands are the marks of nails, that this is in fact Jesus. And some time ago, the statue was the current statue is a very heavy, very solid bronze statue which was cast for the purpose. But before the church had that, they had a light fiberglass one. And at some point, somebody decided it would be an amusing thing to steal this statue. So they did so. The statue just disappeared, and there was disappointment and annoyance expressed on all sides. And the rector of the church, Mother Maggie, put out a request, and word went around through the neighborhood grapevine that this had not been a cool thing to do, and would the person who was responsible for it please return the statue? And about somewhere under a week later, the statue reappeared with a sheepish note saying that it had seemed like a good idea at the time. And it's important to understand that in all neighborhoods, in all circumstances, there is a informal, unwritten set of rules about what behavior is acceptable, and there are people who are never absolutely fully and conclusively identified, who nonetheless function as guardians of these rules. They know people in the neighborhood. They know who's likely to behave and who's likely to misbehave, and they function as a kind of web of trust for the society for the community as a whole. That's the lesson I take from that anyway.
Very good. Thanks very much, John. Now we're going to move down east, where I just have to say one thing about St. John, New Brunswick. I was part of a hackathon with Michael down there, the Atlantic Aqua Hack, and whenever I called a bureaucrat, they would answer their phones. Whenever I phoned my former colleagues in the Ministry of Education, I never get them to answer the phone. Maybe that's because they know who's calling. But at any rate, I just observed that when you call a bureaucrat in New Brunswick, they answer their phones. So with that, Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I guess we'll give a little bit of an overview of the project that we undertook here. I guess one thing from the whole experience that sticks in my mind was one of the discussions we had early on about what it meant to not have identification. And we had a bunch of different people in that discussion share ideas, but one person asked the question, why do we need identification at all? Why isn't it enough, for someone to stand in front of someone and say, here I am, I'm a human, I can move, I can talk, and be able to access basic services. So we had a lot of great discussions and lots of storytelling as well, in terms of different experiences. And one of the funny stories of identification that doesn't even relate to homelessness, because we tried to keep this process as broad as possible, was someone had shared about a parent who did not need to show identification for something like 47 years. And one day they were going to go on a trip or something, and they needed to get a passport. And so they needed identification, and they couldn't find the birth certificate. And so they looked around for several hours, and finally they gave up. And later that night, the father phoned the daughter and said, I found my birth certificate. And she asked where it was, and he said, it was right where I left it 47 years ago. It was he stuck it in a book and put it under the bed. And it had been in that book so long that it had imprinted the ink onto the pages of the book. But he didn't need his ID for all those years for anything. So there's lots of circumstances outside of homelessness that people find challenges with getting or renewing identification throughout their life. So we took a fairly broad approach to this in terms of the project, but the project started with a group in St. John called Kaleidoscope social impact. And they're a group that helps the community with housing initiatives and financial assistance to people in this community. And they had been involved in some research around this identification. One of the papers that we shared a little bit later on was the culmination of that research a couple years ago. And the intention was to move forward with some of those ideas and initiatives and see, if we could improve the situation for people. And because of COVID and other factors, that kind of got put aside. So they wanted a way to reinvigorate, and that's where we came up with the idea of a hackathon to reinvigorate the whole project and the ideas. And so Kaleidoscope and Civic Tech St. John got together as a group to come up with a plan for the hackathon. And I guess it was back in the fall of 2023 we sort of started on this. And we organized a timeline and what our our goals were in terms of the number of teams and so on. And Jonathan from Coburg sat in on many of our discussions as we worked through what this could look like. And we were able to pull together 5 teams for the hackathon, on which we held on April 27th. But we also had several, we called them pre-hackathon sessions that were part of the overall project. And those were designed to give the teams time to form, time to think about the problem. And on each of those nights, we had different activities. One of the nights we had a professor from the University of New Brunswick come in and talk about the design process, design theory of how we come up with a solution to a problem, and different aspects of designing a solution to a challenge. And we also had nights where we had a night where the teams could practice their pitch and learn some strategies on how to give a good pitch. And we also made lots of resources available. We had a group of mentors available to support the teams throughout the process. And I think that was a useful aspect. And we then we had our sort of final hackathon event, which was really just bringing the teams together. We ended up later on in the process, we got another sponsor for the program, Envision St. John, which is an organization that promotes business development and settlement in the St. John region. They offered physical support in terms of a space. We held it at their offices, actually in this building we're in now, near the top floor. And they also offered prize or money that could go towards our hackathon prizes for the teams. And so we had our event on the 27th. We had judges, and we also had a panel discussion about the topic that was held in the afternoon. We provided lunch, and it all went very smoothly. We had, like I said, 5 teams that presented, and the panel of judges had a assessment rubric with 5 different criteria, looking at design, the feasibility, presentation. I can't remember all 5 of them off the top of my head, but I have the rubric if you want to take a look at that. And we wrapped up about a 5.5 hour day that day with all the events and the presentations. And we have not had a chance to have a review of the whole process yet as a team, but we're looking to schedule that soon. But it went very well, and we had lots of very enthusiastic community volunteers from the judges, the panelists, and all of the people, including Saruchi and myself, that were helping to organize this whole event. So we had lots of people that were very interested in making this successful. And we said to all of the teams throughout this process that the hackathon is really just the beginning of this. We want to take this as a starting point, and we want to move forward with this now that we've had the hackathon, because we really do want to see some ideas brought forward that can make a difference with this challenge. Anything to add, Suruchi?
Yep. What I would add, the pitches which were done were with different teams, and all had their own perspective, and the story behind them were different from in terms of the level, from solving the social problem to making it technological solid. John talked about web of trust. One of our member talked about having the blockchain technology as an database for sharing, saving all the data for the ID4 hackathon. So we had the variety of ideas which we take together, discuss, and evolved over the pre-hackathon nights till the day we had hackathon. And it was very tough for all the judges to conclude the winning teams. There were 3 teams which came, but I think each and every team brought the perspective very well. And if we combine all those ideas, it can come as an output to a real solution for the government to organize. And that's the reason I think the aim of doing this workshop is to have similar workshops and come as an output and bring it as a movement towards getting that change done.
Yeah, that's a great point, because we did stress to the teams that there's the actual solution to make it easier to get identification, but there's also the social connections that need to happen in order to help various people in the community understand what the solution means, how to access that, and what services are available, because a lot of times people aren't even aware of the solutions or the services that are available to them. So they don't understand the connection necessarily between, if I have ID, I can get, I could get this subsidy, or I can access this service more easily. So that was really stressed to the groups as part of the challenge, that it's got those 2 aspects to it. How do we make this happen, and what do we make happen? So it was those two aspects. And Suruchi did mention that all of the teams, and the judges mentioned this as well, that they all came up with some unique ideas, and individually none of them had sort of all of the ideas together in their solution, but collectively there was a lot more there. So we do want to continue that exploration and try to move forward with some of these ideas.
And just one thing I'll add, each and every individual had a story to talk about. Like, if I say as a newcomer, for me, when I came here, I definitely have all my paperwork from India, but I did face a challenge that some companies were not giving me the credit card. So I need a New Brunswick ID. I didn't, it will take time for me to get a driving license. So initially I didn't knew that I can go to get the ID, but why we need that ID, definitely that's a question which comes when we have other IDs and we are taking the biometric when we are coming to the country. So converting that physical ID to an database of biometric using technology is a way for the future, I would say.
And I think one aspect that was very prevalent in our hackathon was we had a lot of involvement from the teams, and they brought perspectives from many parts of the world. So a lot of people involved in this were newcomers to this area, and they brought many different perspectives from different countries. And also, one of the things that came up in our panel discussion was how behind Canada is compared to where it could be based on the technology that we have, the expertise that we have, but we have a lot of, social aspects that prevent or make it very difficult for Canada to move forward. And there's other countries in the world with that are much further along this process in terms of more of a universal identification system or something that's more transferable. And that was an interesting learning point for me, certainly, that, it's like we have the ability, but we haven't used it for whatever reason. And there's other places that have made much bigger gains and moved farther on this path than we have here in Canada. So, and it's clear that, we're talking, between Ontario and New Brunswick, two provinces in this country, that this is it's a countrywide challenge, and there's lots of people that are thinking about this. So hopefully we can move forward. Does that give
That's great.
enough of an overview, Jonathan?
Yeah, no, that was good. Just you mentioned that you had a couple of workshops prior to the April 27th hackathon event. Were they part of your regular Tuesday meetups, or were they separate?
No, they were on our Tuesdays, and we told our, all of the members that everyone was welcome. Everyone could participate in terms of a team or participate in the workshop. So we did have teams participate, but we also had regular members participate. So the workshops were sort of, multi-purpose, really. They were for the teams, but they were also useful learning for our community as well.
That's a good point.
The design theory presentation, I thought was particularly effective and relevant to, really any challenge that people are trying to solve. So it was a really excellent workshop. I think we're going to look at bringing Dr. Fleet from UNB. He's the Dean of Economics at the university here in St. John. But I think he was very interested in being involved further with our group. So we're going to look at having him back, I think, for another session.
Well, that's good. And then at Civic Tech Toronto this past Tuesday, we had a very interesting presenter talking about trying to collect information about how people network within a civil society. It was very good and relevant to what we were working on in our project. So that's great. And did you want me to then show the information that we have from your winning team?
Yeah,
So I can show
if I think it's relevant. It was a very well polished presentation, and every member of the group participated in the presentation, and they have I think this is actually the app that they created. And I think there's I think you had a video there too somewhere, Jonathan.
Yeah, I'll just go through the prototype.
Sure.
And what did they use for this? What software is this? Something Figma. What's Figma?
It's a storytelling, a storyboard kind of a software, generally used by the designer, because the lead designer, like there was a designer working in the team, so they use it for mocking up for mobile apps or web pages.
Cool.
And they actually even demonstrated this from their phone just to show that this was an app for a phone. So that was a nice addition to that too.
Yeah. So Figma has the tools which can, import it into a web page or an app automatically after you do some settings. So it can give you a prototype, working prototype.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
How long do you think it would take somebody to create something like this once you had the content?
It's like, because I have done such kind of assessment, I would say it will take around 40 hours of effort in getting such prototype done, the level of
0?
4-0. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so not on a day.
No.
No, but-
It's like, you know, the design theme and having all this done will take time, maybe first draft and then a second draft. So generally teams work multiple drafts before it comes to this level. But if somebody's doing it in 8 hours, it's possible if they know exactly what is required, but it takes iteration before it can. And I'm taking 40 hours as a project manager mindset, you know, if you have to change a time bulb, you will say 5 minutes. I will say no, 2 hours. So that's how that 40-hour came
Yeah.
in.
And then here's their,
Yeah, this was their presentation that they spoke to.
so I could maybe just pull it up like this. Let's see. So they've got a Google Doc there, link. This is one of the personas.
Yep.
Yeah, I was impressed that they had interviewed, what, 300 or something? No, they surveyed 300, but then they had interviews, right? With
Yeah.
different
Yeah, one
people.
of the interesting findings was that a large percentage of, I think it was from this group, if I'm not mistaken, but they found that a large percentage of people who didn't have identification would very much be willing to have, you know, biometric protected digital data, so that they'd be able to access it and not necessarily worry about it being lost or stolen or whatever else. So I think sometimes we worry about the level of privacy, but their surveys found that a lot of people would appreciate that. And so that was, you know, that was some interesting information for them to find. But even just the process of asking people, that showed, you know, they were really willing to dig deep into, you know, this challenge and to get some, you know, real information from people.
Just to
Yeah.
give a bit of a background about this team, this is UNB MBA team, UNB SJ MBA team, current MBA. And the team lead, which is Nikhil, who did this, is a seasoned designer who worked with me in, I think, 15 years back in India. So
Oh, wow.
so he is amazing at what he does. Like I can vouch for him anytime. So that's why it has come up like this, because there's a lot of hard work which has gone in, and the MBA team does tell us how to go about these kind of projects. So those surveys and identification, the whole journey has come up as a project because they have lived through it in other projects while they were learning their MBA lessons, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's it. Let me see. Let's zero out. So they did the goals, the challenges, behaviors, motivations, and needs. And then they have the John Smith. Is this like a persona or?
Yeah, I think that's just a person that they used as
Yep.
an example.
Right. Okay, I get it. And then I haven't clicked on this, but I don't know. Does that go to
That goes to
Google
their
Doc?
survey.
the survey?
Yeah,
Okay.
assuming it's still active or available. I'm not sure if you'll get it or not, but
Well, don't need to do that now.
yeah.
And do you want me to? Oh, this is sort of for all of us to talk about the academic research, although I don't know if you use this one. I thought you used this one. Does this look familiar? This,
No, I
This-
don't think so. I don't think
that's not it, right?
No, that's not the study done locally here.
This is,
Okay. What,
sorry. This is the one from the presenter, this past Tuesday.
oh,
Yeah.
wow. I'm okay. He was good. He impressed me, obviously. So, what was the one that you had? Do you remember it?
Link, yeah.
We got the link in the chat, or
Share the links with you.
I'll put a link to it in the chat.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, while you're doing that, the other research that you cited when we were planning this before the event down there, it was research done from Carleton University back in 2019 or 2018. And they had looked at 4 ID banks in Ontario. I think one was in Guelph. And the idea behind the ID bank was that they would come into a community or neighborhood and, well, if it was Kensington Market, I'm just assuming that uh, the St. Stephen's would be a place of trust, and maybe they have it at St. Stephen's, I don't know, but they would have a filing cabinet where they could leave their ID, and then if they needed it, they could borrow it. In the meantime, they would just have a copy of it, so they wouldn't lose the original. Sort of like the guy putting it in his book for 47 years.
Yeah.
But but then when I talked to somebody here about doing that in a Service Ontario shop, well, the one employee said, "Oh no, we can't do that. That's personal information." But then the other person in the office said, "Well, I have a brother and he's lost his ID 5 times. So sure, I see it, we should do that." So that sort of speaks to John's point earlier, that when you're looking at the problem, you have to look at it on sort of both sides of the aisle, those that are the frontline workers and those that are the ones that have the need. So, and I can't go into details on that research paper of the 4 ID banks, but I know that in our Slack channel, we did put in information about other tutorials offered through some of the community hubs in the city of Toronto, where they would train other workers on how to set up ID for like an ID bank. And
Yeah.
John, do you want to maybe pick up on that?
As far as St. Stephen's, I think will informally hold has in the past, in any case, informally held items for people that were at risk of losing them on the street. I don't think there is a formal program at St. Stephen's to do that. I frankly don't know of any church in Toronto that has a formal program for storing IDs on the basis that you suggest. It's a definitely, I think that some form of identification, what I call identification escrow, would be a very useful service to have. But as far as I know, the churches aren't currently doing this on a formal or organized basis. And that's pretty much all I know about it.
Yeah, yeah. So I scrolled down in this report that Michael has shared the link in the chat. 72%. Cost, required documentation, and time. And then the other part I noted in this research, again, I haven't read it, was the living without an ID.
So there's 300,000 people in Canada that technically don't exist because of identification issues. I think that was the numbers. Saruchi's just bringing it up here now.
Yeah.
I think it
Well,
was
the other thing when I mentioned this
I
to
think that was the
the
one you had there. I think it was
That's the
Sendle.
one?
Yeah, I think
Yep.
it was them.
Yeah. Okay.
So I mentioned ID, and then right away people jump to the digital ID that the government is
Mhm.
working on. And so it's interesting to think about, okay, we're moving into a digital ID. We won't need a lot of the different types of cards if we have like one digital ID. And I suppose that there are pros and cons to that, because if somebody were to hack into your vault, then that would be a real big issue.
I like
Yeah.
to
You want to share the link or?
I've shared all those with Jonathan. Yeah, they have them. Yeah,
Yeah,
it was 1.1 billion, so it was pretty close, and 300,000 in Canada that the way they put it are living without status.
wow, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
It's a lot of people.
Well-
I mean, that's 3 times the size of the city of St. John.
That's amazing. So
Yeah.
now what I could do is I do have the video here. Do you want me to play this? It's maybe 10 minutes long. How do you want me to do this? Your winning pitch.
It's up to you, whatever you feel you have time for. If you is there a way to give everyone the slide deck? They could look at it in more detail later too, if we're good either way.
Yeah, I think if I post it to, if you post it, you have to get permission to post it to a YouTube, and then you can put the link to the YouTube.
Yeah.
I tried to do it from my Google Drive, but it wouldn't accept the link.
Okay.
PowerPoint. Okay, well, that's a good idea. It's fairly long, and I will play the short one. And the idea here is the theme is breaking barriers. So you started to break this barrier by hosting this hackathon.
Mhm.
And we're sort of building a bridge with the Civic Tech Toronto project, similar to the one down there. So we do have the connection between Civic Tech organizations, which is great. And little old Coburg, because we're only a community of 20,000, we have that problem, but we don't have the resources to bring to it. Like if I did a meetup on this, well, I don't know that I would get more than a handful of people showing up, if that. But what I did discover is that at our innovation hub called Venture 13, they have been doing this with students. And I'll just play this briefly.
Jill, tell us about the permanent virtual address and where it led to today.
Sure. So last year during our Youth Pitch to the Chief event, we had a group that was looking to do Housing First, a program that was based out of the Netherlands. And what they realized is it's not a feasible solution given the housing prices in Canada. And so they narrowed it down to creating a virtual address for permanent or virtual permanent address. And so from there, that student graduated and a new team from CCI has picked it up and are looking to create this as a platform for individuals to obtain a permanent address using existing resources within the community.
I'll just add one thing before you end. Like, you know, in our team, they suggested using the post boxes like as in place for the address where the mail can come for a homeless, and it can be used for a creation of ID, that mailbox which can stay in a social organization, and they can get the ID or the bank papers or anything which comes from them
Mhm.
through that. So, you know, something on a similar line, what he said, you know, giving a permanent address, which is not permanent house actually.
Just also
Yeah.
sorry,
Go ahead.
adding on to that as well. I think this was mentioned earlier, Jonathan, by you from the hackathon actually, that the concept of a mailbox, the concept of that safe space where you can be holding IDs can also be a library or like existing public spaces that people are often coming in and out of. So just adding on to that.
Yeah, when we had our panel discussion, the librarian from the St. John Public Library said that they will hold library cards for youth, but not for adults. And so the question was asked, you know, why do you cut the age off at a certain age? And so he gave a bit of a description. You know, it was related to one of the libraries they operate is actually in a school, and so it's easier for them to have the cards for the kids there, so that if they forget their card, they can still, you know, get a book out. But and then we got into you know, just some of those aspects that there's a lot of things that are put in place that make it more difficult. So if we could remove some of those barriers, that alone would make it easier, you know, because sometimes people can't get ID because they don't have a permanent address, but they can't have a permanent address because they don't have ID. Like there's these circular challenges that people can't break out of. And we need to, we need to consider those aspects. One thing that stood out from Darlene from Kaleidoscope, she made a comment one time that if you work at Service New Brunswick or Service Ontario or Service Canada, and you have a day where, you helped 99 people out of 100 that you served, you helped, that's a successful day for the Service Ontario or Service Canada employee. But if you're that one person who didn't get what you needed, it wasn't a successful day for you. And we need to think about, that aspect, that for most people things work out okay, but there's some people that just can't seem to get, a way forward for the challenges they're facing.
I think that's what needs to be factored in. I think from also what we've discussed is how comfortable it is to use a system. Like, not only does it have to function, because you can functionally get, technically, as we talked about, an ID. It's just that there's all these barriers, all these obstacles, and it's just not comfortable. Like, it's very time consuming. It's not like it's impossible, but if the system that we're using isn't good, isn't comfortable, isn't simple, doesn't make the user or the client feel good while they're going through it, then no one's also going to want to use it.
Yeah.
At this point, it's also worth pointing out that a system has to be relatively impervious to the attitudes of the people who are using it, are not using it, but who are administering it. Because we've all experienced the cases where a civil servant is willing to bend a rule slightly or accommodate a need, and other cases where the person is like, no, we close it at 4 o'clock sharp, and yes, it's 3:45, but we don't have time to accommodate your request in 15 minutes, so go away. Attitudes such as that, which very often which can be used to express a hostility to a particular individual in need of service, are realities. And an effective system of identification has to surmount these barriers. Another comment that I was going to make is that a lot of the lack of some of the lack of identification is simply people losing ID, but there is also a point at the interface between communities that are small enough where the web of trust simply exists intuitively, and communities that are much larger. The example was given, for instance, of Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario. I have a very slight experience with working with Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario. It's been put to me that a lot of these communities are essentially family-based. A great many people know each other, and even if there is a particular person in the community that you encounter who doesn't know you, they know somebody who does. And in that circumstance, the provision of formal identification is relatively irrelevant. The problem arises when those people have to interact with the society that we have, which, as Rupert Ross in Dancing with a Ghost memorably put it, we live in a society of strangers, and our need for identification, our use of identification is relevant in that context, so that when people from communities where identity is established informally collide with people with a society in which formal identification is felt to be necessary, that creates, I believe, a significant problem, although it is far from the only one. That's it.
Point. I was going to ask the question. There's a professor who's been around a long time. His name's Barry Whelan. He's a sociologist at the University of Toronto. And I remember him because he was talking about bridging capital and bonding capital. You've probably heard of those terms, right? And to one of the first wired networks in a neighborhood in York region. I forget the name of it. It was a new development, and it was set up to be a bit of an experiment about a wired community, and how what kind of community would develop if you had a network. And that's where you use the term bridging and bonding capital. So the bonding capital is sort of like the traditional indigenous family structure. And then he used the notion of a bridging capital where the individual from that bonded group would still have ability to reach out of the community. And so that was applied to this notion of a networked community. And then more recently, he came out with a new book. And the title of the book, I'll put the title in the chat just a second. It's called Networked, the New Social Operating System. And let me just put it in the thing. Well, actually, it's not that new, 2012. He has been around for a while. But the other book that he sort of writes, this notion of networked, individuals being networked through the social media, he builds up on that, and he counters Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. Do you know that one from the 90s? Yeah, John's shaking his head. So John, help me out here. What Bowling Alone? What was sort of the main thesis? I think I know of it, but I'll blow it. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, okay. I read about the book. I'm afraid I didn't read it myself. But my understanding of the thesis of the book was that it was dealing with a noted phenomenon which has been documented exhaustively since, of the decline of what we used to call civil society, service clubs, community organizations, churches. People are simply withdrawing in various ways, in various respects, into, well, unfortunately, very often simply into themselves. Even families have, in some cases, shrunk or failed to provide support. But definitely the informal structures that once supported people in various ways, just they have been decimated in a lot of places and in a lot of respects. And
yeah, no, I think the Bowling Alone was a reference to that. It was a bowling activity where in Detroit, I believe, they would come together, and that would be a socializing event.
Yep.
Whereas what he discovered is they were out actually bowling alone. The social aspect had disappeared.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just go around, and we don't have much more time, but we could maybe say, what's one thing that we could do if we wanted to continue this work that Civic Tech St. John started, and that we have picked it up in Civic Tech Toronto. And I know that Rock, who couldn't be here, he said, "Oh, it'd be great if we could do one up here, a hackathon up here, maybe in June or something like that." What would your advice be to us, Civic Tech St. John?
Do you want to share some ideas?
Doing the hackathon is a good idea, but one thing which just came right now to my mind is all Civic Tech can start a social movement where what solution we are trying to say can be heard by the actual authorities who can implement it. So kind of a social change page which can be shared and people can sign it. A petition kind of a thing. I don't know how it works in Canada, but in India, when we want to bring some change, we have an social page where people can sign in and share it, and government sometimes here. So ultimately, when we are trying to bring and solve the problem, those ideas need to be further implemented by government. That social change can come when it is coming from top down. That's I would say definitely doing similar hackathon is a very good idea, because that will give us more awareness and people will be conscious about it. And that's what I would say.
I think the hackathon that we ran, having the pre-sessions and starting early, I think was really helpful. It gave the teams lots of time to plan and think and connect with mentors. So I think that was a really useful process to spread it out a bit. We've also had a few discussions around maybe not calling it a hackathon, but calling it something like an ideathon or something different, so that it has a different take on it, maybe. One of our panelists and also one of the mentors was Nick Scott, and he has had a lot of experience working with governments. And one of the things he shared, kind of related to what Suruchi just mentioned about how do we get governments to hear this. And he said that unfortunately, a lot of times governments don't have the bandwidth to do anything more than what they do on a daily basis. So they can't step back and take a look at the processes and look at things. And so quite often they launch, a pilot study, maybe even a large scale pilot on something that hasn't really been thoroughly thought through, and it blows up. And so they end up getting a lot of pushback and scandals and everything because of that. But he feels that's rooted in the idea that governments don't have an ability to take a look at things, in a very purposeful way. They often have to do things quickly or not when they've been sort of thoroughly vetted or thoroughly thought through. So in terms of the hackathon, I think one thing that would be good is to somehow get government involved, either in the panels or in the audience or as judges, so that they can see this stuff firsthand and maybe bring that back. We did try to engage with city politicians, as well as some provincial and even federal, but unfortunately we weren't able to get anybody to be a part of that. So I think that would have been a nice addition to the process. I think the planning, I think we had a good time frame for planning. Like we started early, and there was a lot of stuff that was done by a variety of people early on to get everything organized. So
You had you had 5 teams, and there were the pictures that you sent. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
You had a good
Yeah.
turnout, right?
Yeah.
Did you do any social media campaign for this?
Yeah. We did a lot of social media campaign for that over a period of time, and also word of mouth. Like in the sense, social media campaigns were sent out to different groups. Like we have Crude here, we have Newcomer Center, MBA Society. So those were sharing those social media groups. And then we, as a Civic Tech, we have a regular group of users to whom we have sent the mails. So we actually had more than 7 team initially. Then they turned down to 7, and towards the end there were 5. So even we had a bigger expected audience.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
And I think just that the timelines leading up to it were useful in getting those messages out. So,
Yeah.
we didn't just all of a sudden announce, next week we're having a hackathon. So I think that was worthwhile. And the process of taking the groups through some learning and some training was useful. And we've already been approached, like a couple days after the hackathon, that Envision St. John wants to do another hackathon with us. So so we're not sure what we want to do next, but they've already reached out saying they were really pleased with it, and you know, they
And Michael, who are they? Like, what's their connection to?
Vision St. John is it's a economic development organization that's federally and provincially funded in St. John to basically encourage companies to set up here and for people who are new to St. John to stay here and start businesses and that. So it's
And the nice thing about St. John is you can afford to live there.
well,
Things have changed.
yeah,
I
it's
can-
gone.
No, don't tell me that.
Things are changing.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges with housing here too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cost has increased. The the government says there's lots going on, but there's not as much going on as they say there is. So
Yeah. Now, we're gonna wrap up shortly here, but I want to give John and Chatu an opportunity. And one thing that John told us early on, he said, you can't solve the encampment problem and the homeless problem, but you might be able to take this small little problem about IDs and come up with something that would continue on, that it might actually help. That there could be a potential solution to something small like that. John, did you want to articulate that?
Well, when we're talking about next steps, I would say that the first one of the next steps I think it's important to take is to work out a meaningful consultation process with the people who are actually in the situation of need. I mean, I've been able to talk about my own anecdotes. I have a number, I can recite a number of anecdotes, but I certainly can't speak with any kind of validity for the vast majority of people out there who are currently at significant risk of losing their IDs for whatever reason. And it would be good if we could actually approach those people, because solutions that seem to us as though they would be intuitive and workable may for various reasons not be, including for reasons that for instance somebody like myself would regard as fundamentally irrational. But I can't say, well, that's not rational, therefore you must accept the solution I give you, because that attitude is very much part of the problem in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So I would urge people who are I would urge people, hackathons are great and it's appropriate to do them again, but I would urge people as part of their research to come to a place like St. Stephen's or another drop-in across the city and just sit down with people and see if you can figure out what they need.
Mm-hmm.
In a more or less formal and scientifically rigorous way, so that you can say, okay, there's you can articulate a reasonable probability that the results you're getting are more or less representative. I know, for example, that within the community, people who are within the street involved community, paranoia, which is very often, unfortunately, somewhat justified, and distrust of government institutions is not exactly unknown. And those people are in need of ID too. So then you have the question of, well, what are they prepared to put into an escrow program? What biometric data, if any, would they be willing to surrender? And until these are things that that I think would be very useful to have better answers to than we currently have. I'll just put that very cautiously in and leave it at that. And that's pretty much my comment at this stage of the game.
Chatu, you get the final word.
Well, this is good because mine is a kind of a conclusion of both the anecdotes or segments that we just talked about. But so starting off with adding government officials and talking to more people in government who are actually in the process. It doesn't only have to be those in government. It could be, if you go on the scale, these caseworkers, anyone who's actually currently talking to and is present in giving the forums, giving information. those individuals are the ones who really know all the pains and really understand not only the process itself, but how feasible, as John was saying, some of the solutions can be. Because we can ideate as far as we can, and we can come up with all this full fleshed out features that would solve this problem. But what if there's something that we can do on a smaller scale during these hackathons or ideathons that would just start solving bit by bit? That's why I think a lot of these people who are present in the process, caseworkers, social workers, would be really helpful to have present, maybe as judge, maybe as someone who can give more consultation, maybe as someone who can present more anecdotes, as John was saying, to really understand the process and to see how feasible these solutions are. And maybe we can get something off the ground. Maybe something goes off the ground. So that's our final word.